Okay, we can start with Galileo Galilei of Pisa, Italy. He discovered Saturn, amongst many other things. Sir William Herschel was a German-British astronomer that discovered Uranus. The Parisian Leverrier, he predicted Neptune. And lo and behold, John Couch Adams of Cambridge, England, discovered Neptune. Percival Lowell of Boston, Mass. Had predicted that there would be a planet beyond Neptune. And then Clyde W. Tombaugh of Las Cruces, New Mexico, by means of Burdett, Kansas, and Streator, Illinois, discovered Planet X, Pluto. Clyde W. Tombaugh was born in 1906 in Streator, Illinois, which is a small town nestled in between Peoria and Chicago, roughly about halfway in between. And the town was doing well at the time. And the Tombaugh family was also doing well, farming just outside of town. And Clyde, the oldest of 6 kids, was doing well in school and had good teachers at the time and had a good library as well. But the family got the invitation to come out to Kansas. There was a homestead available for them and just northeast of Dodge City out in Burdett. It was the plains. It was a different atmosphere, but it held a lot of potential, and so they moved. And Clyde was good in school once again, but there was a lot to do on the farm. It was a little more uphill than what they had experienced in Illinois, and so there were endless chores and a lot of work to be done. But Clyde also had interests himself. An Uncle Lee had shown a telescope to the young Clyde, and Clyde was smitten with what you could see at night looking through that telescope. So Clyde decided he'll just make his own. And so with parts that he could find around the farm, anything off of an old tractor or a cream separator, he began to also teach himself how to grind lenses, how to make the lens for the top and for the mirrors for the bottom. He would sketch out what he was able to see in the heavens at night, whether it was the craters on the moon or what he could roughly make out of Mars. And he realized that there was a little too much temperature instability around where he was viewing, and so he just went ahead, got his pick and shovel, and began the project of digging 8 foot down by 7 foot wide by about 24 feet long, and made a soil pad that would give good consistent temperature. And it did help. Now keep in mind, this was in addition to all the other things, all the chores and all the labor and all the fixing they had to do on the farm itself. Now, Kansas was a much different atmosphere from what they had known in Illinois, and this is still a time prior to there being any really good articulate weather prediction or radar. And so a storm could kick up, and nobody really knew what that storm might hold. Well, one time a storm did kick up, and it held indeed the worst. As the family's entire fortune was really tied up in the homestead and in the crops that were in the field, one time a terrible storm came through and destroyed the crops and a good part of the farm, and with it, Clyde's hope of going to college. It was a sad turn of events, but Clyde continued on. And as he would continue to sketch at night, he began to send some of those sketches down to the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, and they took quite a shine to this young kid in Kansas, and he was asking how he could improve his observations and what he might do different. And so in return, after a season, the Lowell Observatory actually sent him a note and asked him if he would like a job. And so he said yes. There were other offers out there, but he went ahead and moved down to a state where he knew no one, with little money in his pocket, and started becoming the jack of all trades for the Lowell Observatory, fixing things here, working on new projects there, and becoming the guy that sat at the comparator night after night. The comparator is where you would take a picture of a specific part of the sky, thousands of little dots of light, wait a few days, maybe a week, and then take the same compositional picture of that part of the sky and see what had changed. And then with the comparator, you would just go back and forth between those two images and see if you could recognize any patterns or movement. Well, lo and behold, Clyde saw something moving. And he recognized it, pointed it out to Dr. Slifer, who was the head of the observatory at the time. And indeed, the young boy from Kansas found Planet X. He found Pluto. Within a short amount of time, he was on the New York Times front cover, and he gained fame as the guy that found another planet in our solar system. This great turn of events also meant that he could get a scholarship. Matter of fact, KU gave him a scholarship for free. And he began to study astronomy and science, and met his wonderful wife there and met some family there. And after he graduated, he was offered a position to teach at University of New Mexico, where he was for quite a long time. And as the years went on, he was indeed the consummate professor. Students loved him, and he knew how to communicate information. Later on in his golden years, he got a little frail, and it was too much to try and lug around one of his telescopes. So he attached it to the base of an old lawnmower, and he called it the Grazer Gazer. And he was able to wheel out one of his favorite telescopes to still observe things at night. Well, in 1997, he passed away, but that's not the end of the story. Early in the 2000s, Dr. Alan Stern began pushing for funding for an exploration project that would go to Pluto, the Kuiper Belt, and beyond. And when New Horizons got funding, they launched, and they had a special cargo along with their spaceship that actually flew by Pluto itself, carrying some of the ashes of one Clyde W. Tombaugh. What follows is part of an interview with both the daughter and son of Clyde W. Tombaugh, Annette and Alden. And we begin by talking about Uncle Lee and his importance of sowing seeds of a love for science in the young Clyde. So we owe a great debt to Lee in many ways, of not just sowing the seeds, but getting some practical tools.
That's true, and a couple of my father's teachers. He had some really excellent teachers in Streator area. They didn't live in Streator per se; they lived near Streator. Between his uncle and the teachers and the community, because it was a vibrant community in Streator, he became very interested in science and astronomy. And then when they moved to Kansas, my father had to drop out of high school for a while to prove the farm.
Wow.
He, of course, eventually got back in high school, and he was interested in a lot of things, including sports. He lettered in track and field. So that's how they got to Kansas.
Son of a gun. It always kind of hit me too that the life that you get out of farming many times is you have to become a jack of all trades.
You do. And my father, he did farrier work. He made barrels. He did all sorts of metal work. The farm in Kansas was pretty much self-contained, self-sustaining. They did everything on that farm. In the summertime, we cousins would go and help with the harvest.
And you were growing wheat, I'm assuming?
Yes, we grew wheat. We ran cattle, grew wheat, grew oats, had chickens, had a pretty good egg business, dairy.
It took a patchwork of skills to make life happen.
It did.
Yes.
It did. And you have to be versatile, and you have to be a hard worker.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
Sometimes you have to take some pretty hard knocks when the weather doesn't agree with you.
That brings us to the terrible, fateful storm that did in the crops and also did in his potential for college. How did he talk about that whole time?
Well, it was a very scary situation. The storm was very scary in and of itself, and it just wiped out the crop, and that wiped out his chance to go to college completely. But he eventually got to college, of course, because he got a scholarship after he discovered Pluto.
Yes. Did he ever talk about, it's funny, I was reading through of the account of, getting contacted from the Lowell Observatory of literally offering him a job. And you think, those were lean times. It weren't easy farming. And I can't imagine what a fairy tale moment that must have felt like for him of hearing from that kind of authority.
Well, he didn't know why he had, he had sent in the drawings because he didn't have the photographic equipment back then. He sent in the drawings off a 9-inch, and my dad was very interested in optics and making telescopes, and he wanted to see if there were any improvements that that they could suggest. He had a job offer at an optics company, but they offered him this job in Flagstaff, and it was a combination of things. He was just going to go out and work on telescopes, and he loved it so much that that's what he did. He had no idea that it was for the search for Planet X. He did a lot of janitorial work. They really wanted somebody that was cheap, could do janitorial work, was strong, and could also survive in very inclement weather. And so he was a sturdy, young man that was interested in things, and he was used to a hard life because farming in those days was a hard life.
Yes, ma'am. So they basically signed up to get a young buck that was smart and thought, oh, this is it. Come on over.
And cheap, yes. And it was in compliance with Lowell's will.
Oh,
okay. Percival died a long time, really quite a while before my father went there. But his widow was still alive. And if you read some of the accounts, particularly a book that just came out is called Pluto and Lowell Observatory, written by Kevin Schindler and Will Grundy, and I wrote the foreword to the book.
Oh, wonderful.
That would give you a pretty good background of the information you're looking for.
I'll get that for sure. The one thing that I've always been struck, it's funny, even when I see pictures of your dad, he was just a natural teacher. It just seemed he had such an ability to not just present information, but to help people unpack it and how to do it in stages without overwhelming them, but still keep people engaged. It's like he had a whole suitcase of natural abilities that really...
He did. He had a lot of natural abilities. Of course, he was the oldest out of all of the kids. There were 6 children, and he was the oldest, and a lot of the responsibility fell on him. And, at 16 in those days, you were considered an adult. From the time you could toddle walk, you had chores to do. He was a hard worker, but he really loved teaching. Above everything else, I think he loved teaching.
Mm-hmm. It still strikes me too that I think if I had to give him a middle name or a nickname, it always seems like tenacity, and not clawing to get something, but it just seemed like he could stick with something, and he had an ability to kind of keep his head straight and really work through a thing slowly and deliberately without getting exhausted about it. That was Dad. Okay. You've got it. You've got his entire personality there. Teacher, teaching and very methodically working out problems. He liked working with his hands a great deal. He was always inventing things to solve problems, and he used the materials at hand at all times because he was, when he was a person of the Depression, of the Dust Bowl, of that time. And you didn't go out and just buy things. You used whatever was available. Yes, ma'am. I think I noticed in one picture that there was a telescope. I think I recognize that chamber as being part of a wheat auger, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. His 9-inch telescope had, part of it was a cream separator. That's awesome. Part of it was the tube off of one of the silo grain thrashers. And then for covers for his optics, he used cans that had been used. Everything, it's just like the telescope he put together that the base is a lawnmower base, okay? So he could roll it out, the gazer. I thought that was so beautiful because when I compare it to all of the forebears, and you mentioned Percival Lowell, he came from a family of considerable means. And
Oh, no kidding. The Lowells of Massachusetts, of course. You know, Amy Lowell, the poet, was his sister.
yes, ma'am. And you go through the list, and it's one august scientist after another. Well, I hate to be so crass about it, but they never had to worry about where their food was coming from. They never had to do any of those things.
The Lowells were very, very wealthy.
Yeah.
And, you know, they had the luxury of traveling, of less practical skills, shall we say. They had that luxury. My father came from absolutely the opposite background.
It's wonderful to get the insight of Annette Tombaugh into her dad's life and experience. We also get a chance to talk with Alden, the son of Clyde Tombaugh. For a guy that had this kind of whole palette of kind of almost innate skills, or at least things that he didn't fear a good challenge, and he didn't fear having to work to kind of figure something out and kind of make his way. Were there any things that he struggled with? Like I had asked, you know, was math or physics, was there any dynamic of it that didn't come natural, that it was an uphill for him?
I don't think any of it really came naturally to him. He had to work for all of it.
Wow.
You know, he didn't consider himself to be, you know, in the 120 plus IQ or anything like that. So he just understood some of the basics, and then was willing to put in the work to find out through learning all about the particulars of any endeavor that he was after. One of the things that he disliked the most was the notoriety. He was rather a shy person, so he did not really relish the notoriety at all.
And then the irony for me comes in of shy person that just wants to discover and have other people alongside him. He didn't want to be on a pedestal, but he just wanted other people to realize the joy of that. And yet there was jealousy about that. It seems time and time again, whether it was Dr. Slifer or indeed Dr. Stern from New Horizons. I've seen a number of interviews where he talks about Brian Marsden from IAU and this kind of...
Yeah, you know, and Dad, of course, even Brian... Well, I can't say that Brian Marsden necessarily held a grudge or anything like that. In my opinion, Marsden was his own person, and he just viewed things a little differently than what my father did. And so they had some disagreements as to how things should be done and how things should be named, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So this is a conflict of philosophy at some level, as much as, and not as much personality in some deep sense.
A light conflict.
Okay.
I'd say it wasn't a heavy conflict.
Okay. I guess the capstone still for me in the story of your dad is the beautiful thought that even right now, a small portion of his ashes are speeding out of our solar system and heading further beyond anything that could have been imagined, beyond where anything's gone before, and indeed past Pluto itself. Not that long ago. How did you get contacted by the New Horizons folks, or how did it come about?
Well, Alan Stern had a lot to do with that, and he had contacted my sister and asked if there were, near my father's death. See, Alan had been working on this project, the New Horizons project, for years and years and years, trying to get funding for it. He'd been turned down, 3 or 4 or 5 times. So he was involved with the whole process for a long time, and he contacted my sister and asked if there were any ashes that could possibly go on the mission, and she said yes. And of course, all that now would not have happened after the redesignation of Pluto. The whole New Horizons mission, if the redesignation of Pluto had happened before that, the government, in all likelihood, would have scratched the New Horizons mission.
They would have missed the fact that Pluto is indeed a planet with subterranean ocean, very geologically.
Well, they would have missed everything. They would have missed everything, of course, because what they do is they follow the government and the media and whatever follows major objects, major concerns, major everything, whatever's more newsworthy. And once Pluto was demoted or what they call demoted to planetoid, or whatever they want to call it.
Yeah.
Then that would have taken the focus away from that, because it was a very expensive and very time-consuming effort to put the New Horizons together and have it actually work. So that, in all likelihood, would have been scratched, not knowing, of course, what they would have found and the obvious things that they continue to find in the Kuiper Belt and so forth from that mission.
Yes.
So, in Prague, when they reclassified planets, which, in my opinion, and the members of our family's opinion, and Alan Stern, too, thinks was a total hoax, because what happened, I don't know whether you know or not, but what happened was on the final day of the Prague meeting, when a lot of people were out making their transportation connections and reservations and getting ready to leave, this group decided that they'd stay and ramrod this definition down the throats. Several days before that, the executive committee, a member of the executive committee of the IAU, had called my mother and said, "We've come up with a definition, and Pluto would fit as a major planet in this definition." Well, that never came to vote, and the other one came to vote, and because there were so many of the planetary scientists that weren't there that disagree with this definition totally, that got passed. And so it was kind of a sham. It certainly wasn't good science.
I think that's the one thing from Dr. Stern, too, is just an incredulity, and him, too, having a sense of, this is just morally it's wrong. And that the inconsistency, I think the classic that he said is, well, we're not going to vote on what elements are in the periodic table at any point either, are we? That it just doesn't make sense in any way, shape.
Well, it didn't make sense from a lot of points. The way it was done didn't make sense. It didn't follow any scientific rules. The definition, if it's strictly adhered to, several of the other planets wouldn't be planets.
Yes.
And one of the tragedies, I think, of the whole thing is that it caused textbooks to be rewritten, which was really on a false premise. Now, I'm not going to say, and even Dad knew, that there may be a different definition for other planets in the far reaches of the solar system, but certainly not based on bad science, So the tragedy is that the history has changed, and particularly the learning scales have changed through textbooks that really was based on bad information.
Yeah, that's right. It's a beautiful story, and I have to say, it's one of the most inspiring things to just know. It's funny to think of small town of Burdett, Kansas, or Streator, Illinois, that something majestic as far as accomplishment could come out of that area, because you wouldn't think it necessarily in driving through there. But it sure can.
There are a lot of fine people, though, that are in that area.
That's true.
And a lot of very people that are dedicated to their profession.
Yes, sir. Mr. Tombaugh, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much. You have made my day, my week, and my year. It was a real honor to speak with you. I sure appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much.
There are few moments of privilege that so define graciousness and generosity as the time that we were gifted by Annette and Alden Tombaugh. Both are busy, both with many things tugging at them, and the fact that they could spare this valuable time is a huge honor. We're grateful for both of them, and thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.